With the 2024 U.S. presidential election already picking up, we're once again hearing big promises from the candidates about how they'll make life better for, you guessed it, the all-important middle class.
The working class and the middle class. That's who built this country. And by the way, the middle class built America, and unions built the middle class.
Look at the economy. The Biden administration is doing all it can to make it harder for the average family to make ends meet and to attain and maintain a middle-class lifestyle. The bill for the massive borrowing, spending, and debt and record printing of money by the Fed, that's falling on the American people.
Bloomberg senior writer Sean Donnan is back on the show today to tell us why the middle class isn't necessarily such an easy group to pin down or pander to.
The American middle class is 100 million adults, and we often talk about those folks as a kind of amorphous mass that all share these common traits. And it's an incredibly diverse population. It's black and white and Latino, it's older, it's younger, it's Republican, it's Democrat, it's increasingly independent.
Sean and a team of reporters went out to speak to middle-class voters about their lives and how their circumstances will influence who gets their vote.
I've never needed to be the wealthiest person, but I need to have enough that I feel secure in.
I have still one child in college. We assist her with school and housing. I just don't know how much longer I can do that with prices going up.
I'm Wes Kosova. Today on The Big Take, what does the middle class really want? Sean, good to see you again.
It's so wonderful to be here.
So on our very first show, you and I were talking about the fortunes of the American middle class, and we're back again talking about it. 8 months later, what's changed? Because you've been doing quite a bit of work on this.
So we're spending a lot of time looking at what we think of as the economic health of the American middle class. And that American middle class is those 100 million people, those 100 million adults who make between $45,000 and $185,000 a year or so, and who have wealth of just under $100,000 in assets to just over $1 million in assets. We think that covers a pretty good portion of the American economy, and that's a portion of the American economy that is being hit by a number of different factors over the last year, or the last couple of years, really, through the pandemic. One is the inflation we've all been watching and feeling, but they're also being hit by the reaction from the Federal Reserve in raising interest rates to that inflation as well, which has hit their wealth and it's hitting the cost of their debt. And that American middle class, as we all probably know, has a lot of debt, whether it's in the form of mortgages, car payments, credit card balances, or student loans. And so we're watching this American middle class closely get buffeted by this end of an era, and that's the end of an era of easy money, low interest rates that have made life pretty good for the American middle class for over a decade.
And even in the time since we last talked about this, these winds that are buffeting the middle class, as you describe it, have picked up. And you found some pretty significant increases in just what it costs to live. And we're all kind of feeling it, but you've put numbers on it. Can you give us a picture of that?
The American middle class, the average household in that middle class, spend $8,000 more each year than they did before the pandemic on household spending. And that's not just because it was easy spending and times were good. A lot of that was on items you can't escape, like transportation. The cost of owning a car last year hit over $10,000 annually when you factor in car payments, insurance, maintenance, and so on. That's according to AAA.
And that's the first time ever.
That's the first time ever. It's crossed that limit. The median house, if you want to go out and buy it today, before in 2021, that would have cost you a monthly payment about $1,200. That's now $2,400. That's a doubling in the monthly payment that we've seen as interest rates have gone up. We've seen the Federal Reserve in its most dramatic tightening, raising of interest rates since the 1980s in response to inflation that was at its highest level in 40 years. It makes sense. But, you can talk about that in these kind of vague terms that make economic sense. But when you bring it down to the household level, there are just all of these costs. The household budgets have just been reordered, and that's really hard to escape.
And we've talked quite a bit on the show about how hard it is to find an affordable place to live, whether you're renting or buying a house. And one thing your research also showed is that now people are taking money out of their houses again.
Right. So we're seeing people tap their home equity again. Over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of American middle-class families that own homes have made a lot in terms of home equity. And they were refinancing during the pandemic. Well, now, as costs have risen and they're trying to keep the household running and pay for new expenses like kids going off to college or healthcare expenses or maintenance on the house, they're tapping that equity at a much higher level. And that is, some people think, often a sign of financial stress.
And in recent years, people were able to offset some of these pressures because their investments were doing well. The markets were really high. And that, too, has given us all a reality check.
Yeah. And look, the American middle class was getting wealthier over the last 15 years in a really dramatic way. And in fact, in a pretty historic way over the last year and a bit. Since the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates in March of 2022, the American middle class has lost somewhere between $2 and $3 trillion in wealth as an overall class. That's those 100 million people. You bring that down to the individual level, and that's somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 in lost wealth over that time, which is significant if you're talking about adults that are earning between $45,000 and $180,000 a year. It's a big chunk to take. And people say that's paper wealth. Well, paper wealth is also what you borrow against, right? It's also the thing that helps you finance the longer-term investments like your kids' education. So many American families draw on home equity and their wealth to pay for their kids' college, for example.
And to add to this list of challenges is also that we're starting to see more layoffs across industries, whereas in the last several years, the job market has been incredibly strong.
If you believe the economists, we are on the cusp of what is very likely to be a recession, certainly a slowing in the economy. Whether we actually get a contraction, we don't know yet. But we're starting to see layoffs in the tech sector, in finance, anything associated with mortgages. We are starting to see manufacturers do some laying off as well. And what we've just described until now, that rising household costs, that decline in wealth, that's all in the past. What's ahead is pretty frightening as well, potentially, or anxiety-inducing, certainly for the American middle class. And that's a possible recession, possibility of job losses. And one of the features we've seen in these job losses, a lot of them have been white-collar jobs so far.
And so here we are talking about this now at the very beginning of another long, contentious presidential election, and that gives it an extra layer of urgency, too.
Absolutely. Look, there's an economic reason we're interested in the American middle class. Those 100 million adults are at the center of a consumer-driven U.S. economy. They're the people out there in the shops making the big purchases that keep the American economy humming along. Those 100 million adults are also at the core of the American electorate, how they feel about the economy and how they feel about whether it's Joe Biden's management of the economy and his vision for the economy, or whether it's his Republican opponent's dueling vision for the American economy. That is going to be one of the fundamental issues in this campaign. So that's one of the reasons we're going to be tracking the American middle class from here to forever, I feel like.
Let's talk about what you did in the story, which was to take these big economic numbers and bring them to a personal level by talking to individual Americans in the middle class and what their experience has been like.
We are, and we're going to be running this through the election next year, have teamed up with Harris, the pollsters, and they are running out a poll every quarter for us. And we're able, with their cooperation, to target this actual middle class, to make it a poll of the middle class, not just of the broader electorate or registered voters, which most pollsters do. And working with Harris, we've also been able to link up with some of these people that they're talking to. We did about 24 interviews with people in the middle class. We're also bringing in people who we as reporters have met along the way. We've spent a lot of time on the road. We've all met characters in that middle class who we have stayed in touch with, and we're going to be coming back to them and liaising with them. And look, the four people who we feature in this story are really emblematic of a broader class. And there's a couple of different themes that we can talk about.
And each of these people really exemplified one or more of these pressures that you were just talking about.
As you go through the American middle class, everyone has individual experience in terms of the economy. It's part of the reason we're reaching out to all these people.
Being middle class in America today is not the same that it was 10 years ago.
Middle class kind of tends sometimes to be in that range where you can afford some things, but you're still, not able to maybe get everything you want.
We have been talking to folks in Florida and Minnesota and up in Michigan and New York State, all over the country. And what we're trying very hard to do is to make sure that we have diversity in terms of not just politics. There's Republicans, Democrats, and a whole lot of independents out there right now, but also in terms of race and age and so on. What's very clear when we talk about the American middle class and we talk about this big population is that there's a lot of different factions within that mass.
After the break, what do middle-class Americans themselves have to say about all this? One of the middle-class Americans who tells about her experience in this story is Lori Blumstein. Our colleague Claire Ballantyne spoke to her, and let's listen to some of what she had to say.
My name is Lori Blumstein. I'm 64 years old. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, but have been living in Florida for the last 40 years. My main profession for the last 40 years was in the finance mortgage business. Started out in banking as a teller and worked my way up, and then was a mortgage loan processor and mortgage loan closer.
If you want to look at how the end of this era of easy money is hitting the American middle class, then Lori is a pretty vivid example of that. She is a white retiree in Florida. She was laid off last August from her job working in the mortgage industry because the mortgage industry just shut down, essentially.
Something that nobody would have thought just a few years ago.
Absolutely. And, even just a year before that was really booming. She's gone from living on a salary of roughly $100,000 a year to living on just under $2,000 a month in Social Security payments.
Social Security is not the greatest thing to live on, and health care is not the greatest to have. Once I finally can get on health care, that is.
She's moved out of a 3-bedroom house into a smaller condo. She has reset her life in a very different way. She'd love to get back to work, but she says, I only know one thing, and that's the mortgage industry, and right now it's in the toilet.
And yet what I found interesting about her story, too, was that she felt like even though her fortunes had changed dramatically, she still felt like she was okay and plans to take a couple cruises this year.
And that's a kind of crucial thing that we need to keep in mind as we talk about the American middle class, right? Being a member of the American middle class means having a measure of economic security. It means that when tough times hit, you have an ability to ride it out. And Lori has reset her life, but she also has plenty stashed away so she can have those cruises and has a fairly comfortable life.
And Sean, Lori Blumstein is just one of many people you say you spoke to, and you tried to get a pretty diverse cross-section of American middle-class people.
Absolutely. The American middle class is 100 million adults, and we often talk about those folks as a kind of amorphous mass that all share these common traits. And it's an incredibly diverse population. It's black and white and Latino. It's older. It's younger. It's Republican. It's Democrat. It's increasingly independent. So we are trying very hard to make sure that we hear from all the different factions within that middle class.
Sean, another person in the story is Ron Davis, and you spoke to him. What did he have to say?
Ron Davis is a white man married to a black woman living in the suburbs of Minneapolis. He is a business executive, and he's a business executive whose fortunes really tell the story of the last few years for the American middle class.
And here he is.
My name is Ron Davis, and my age is 55, soon to be 56.
And how do you feel about that, turning 56?
It's better than the alternative. So, it's getting old is not necessarily fun, but it beats not getting old.
He used to run the loyalty program for North and South America at Radisson, the hotel group. When the pandemic hit, he was laid off from them at the end of 2021. For the first time in his career, he found himself unemployed and looking for a job, and he was a pandemic victim. He found a job in the tech industry. He found a job with GoDaddy, where he was running a loyalty program for them, and in February of this year, he was told that he had been laid off by them as well. So he's a victim of tech layoffs as well.
Loyalty is not just about customers to a brand and brand love. Loyalty is also about employees, because no one's going to be loyal to a brand that their employees aren't happy.
Ron is a relentlessly cheery person despite all of this. He will also tell you that he's been lucky and that he's managed to stash some money away over time. He and his wife, he'll tell you slightly sheepishly, drive his and hers Mercedes. They just bought their 21-year-old daughter a Mini. They are in a pretty comfortable place as well. But what's interesting with Ron is when you talk with him, you also get a sense he's, for the first time in his career perhaps, encountered the vulnerability that's there in the American middle class.
Middle class, to me, I guess I would define it as somebody who is able to have shelter and food and health care and those type of things and be able to afford it, but not to the point that they're no longer worried about money at all.
It's been an uncomfortable few years for him as a man in his 50s being laid off in an economy that tends to trend younger.
I kind of tested retirement at this time and found that it's not necessarily for me for a couple of reasons. One is I think I would drive my wife nuts. And then second of all, I think I still have more to give and more to give back.
Let's talk about another person too, and that's Mel Mills.
In many ways, he is emblematic of a certain new Black professional middle class that we're seeing in America.
Our colleague Claire also spoke to him.
My name is Mel Mills. I'm 37 years old from Detroit, and I'm a digital marketer. I'm also an author, so I'm going to be doing a lot of promotion for a coming book launch.
If you talk to him, and again, you scratch the surface, he's watched his investments take a hit this year.
I think being middle class in America today means being able to afford a kind of a certain lifestyle. Right, and so you're in the better neighborhoods with the better schools. Maybe you have a degree or things of that nature, a nicer car, certain amenities, and certainly in terms of just economically, probably not living paycheck to paycheck.
He will tell you that his grocery bill each month is higher than it's ever been, and he will also talk through how he uses 5 or 6 different credit cards to make ends meet each month and to keep the household running.
You also spoke to a retired former police officer in Texas. Let's listen to what she had to say.
My name is Tammy Reno, and I'm 56 years old. I am from Temple, Texas. I retired after 30 years in law enforcement.
She's a white woman, a retiree who lives in Granbury, Texas, which is in the outskirts of Fort Worth with her husband. She is, I think it's fair to say, a out-and-out Republican, a supporter of Donald Trump. And when she talks about the economy, she does it through a partisan lens, but also when you think about her personal situation, she's watched her retirement savings take a big hit in the markets over the last couple of years.
The one thing that I feel the most on is our retirements. The stock market and our mutual funds and things like that have gone way down. I experienced over a 20% drop in my retirement funds, and I'm worried about it.
She also talks about going out to the grocery store and she's clipping coupons and looking to save and buying in bulk and freezing lots of stuff.
We started changing some of our lifestyle. We don't travel near as often. We don't eat out as often. I've always been a thrifty person, which helped me save quite a bit over the years. I was a single mother, and so that was imperative. What it means to be middle class in America, I think, is the middle class is getting squeezed. There's programs for people with less means. There's a lot of tax cuts for, high earners, but in the middle, we're having to pay all of our taxes. We're having to, purchase groceries. We're having to purchase gas, which it's gone high in price.
She's someone who feels the squeeze in retirement and is quite angry about it.
When we come back, many fed-up middle-class voters are ditching party affiliations and calling themselves independent. Sean, as we talked about at the start, all the stories we're hearing right now are going to prominently figure into people's decisions about who to vote for in the 2024 presidential elections, who to vote for Congress. What are you hearing about how these different pressures people are feeling are affecting the way they vote?
We're entering a really interesting election in that Joe Biden as president has pitched pretty much every policy that he does, whether it's economic policy, industrial policy, even foreign policy, as aimed at the American middle class and making sure that it benefits the American middle class. American presidents are always obsessed with the American middle class because the American middle class tends to vote a little bit more than some other classes. But Joe Biden is pretty unique in having pitched his entire presidency as being about the American middle class. Joe Biden also, when you zero in on his economic policy, has really tried very hard to rebuild American manufacturing through industrial policy to create incentives to have new electric vehicle plants, new battery plants, new semiconductor plants. All of those are aimed at building, as he will tell you, new middle-class jobs into the American economy, bringing home a lot of those jobs that have been outsourced. But those are also long-term projects. A lot of those factories are being built now, but they may not be in place before the election. In many ways, the election in 2024 is going to be a referendum on Joe Biden and the American middle class and how it's doing. And right now, if you look at how the American middle class feels about the economy, the polls show that they're feeling pretty anxious. Our poll with Harris showed anxiety and stress topping the list of emotions for middle class folks when they look out at the U.S. economy. We also see only about a third of middle-class people that we poll think that things are going to get better in the year ahead in terms of their personal financial situation. That's not a good starting point if you're a president who's pitching to the American middle class. There is a partisan divide in that. Republicans tend to view the economy as being worse than, and to be more stressed about the economy than Democrats, but still only about 40% of Democrats say they think that things are going to get better in the year ahead. Again, that's not a great starting point for a Democratic president. What we hear over and over again also from people in the middle class is that they're waiting to make a judgment. Lori Blumstein will tell you that she is going to vote for Joe Biden no matter what. Tammy Pearson will vote for Donald Trump or whoever the Republican candidate is, no matter what. But we also have a much bigger mass of independents in America today. There's a Gallup tracking poll that shows that 49% of Americans now identify as independents. It used to be roughly a third Democrats, third independent, third Republicans. That's changed over the last few years. And that's true of the middle class. And so we're going to wait and see how they swing. It's too early to call it. But this is the reason we are tracking the economic health of the American middle class, because we know that American voters care about pocketbook and household budgets.
Well, what you said earlier is important, the idea that despite the fact that people are uncertain about the economy, most Americans have hardened their views on who they blame for almost anything. But it's that section in the middle. And one person who I thought was really interesting was Mel Mills, who seemed to have a very broad view of who he might vote for.
Yeah, and so does Ron Davis, by the way. And this is a white man in the suburbs of Minneapolis and a black man in the suburbs of Detroit, right? Two very different people in different parts of America, and both of whom feel disenchanted with the regular parties and feel like the regular politicians, the Democrats and Republicans, aren't really speaking to the American middle class, which is really interesting because both of those parties are trying very hard.
And both of them signal that they may not vote for the ultimate Republican candidate or for Joe Biden and may go looking elsewhere.
Right, which is another thing that we may see in terms of third-party candidates popping up in the election next year. And maybe they will bleed off some of the votes from the middle class, which could have a significant impact on the election.
We've talked about several of the people you spoke to, but you spoke to many more. How do the politics line up among people you're talking to? How many people are saying they don't want the Democrat or the Republican?
The common theme you hear from folks is the economy and what I'm seeing and the squeeze that I'm feeling is causing me to look harder at my political decisions. The second thing you hear is, I haven't made up my mind yet. You hear that a lot. I'm going to wait and see who the Republicans decide on as a candidate. And then the third thing you hear is just this anxiety and stress about the economy and frustration out there. There's a lot of policies being aimed at them, but the middle class doesn't necessarily think it's feeling the benefits.
The old cliche in American politics was always that people vote their pocketbooks, that if the economy is good, the incumbent wins, the economy is bad, they try somebody else. But lately, with culture wars and other issues coming to the fore, that's not so true anymore, that sometimes people will actively vote against their economic interest because a candidate is attractive to them for another reason.
Yeah, no, look, and absolutely. Look, I'm an economics reporter at Bloomberg News, a financial news service. I am conscious of the fact that I spend a lot more time thinking about the economy and economics and all of that data than a lot of people do, and that there are other issues out there. And we certainly saw that in the midterm elections, right, where a lot of people thought that inflation was going to fuel a red wave that was going to see the Republicans seize control of Congress, possibly even the Senate. That didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because these culture wars and other issues like abortion rights, guns even entered the debate. And so we certainly are likely to see that next year.
So ultimately, do you think that all of these things we're talking about are the thing that swing the election, or is it just one important thing that goes into a big swirling pot and it's hard to tell whether the economy will be one of the most important things that people make their choice on?
I'm going to vote for the big swirling pot, but I also think that in some ways the economy is the stock. It's the broth. It's the foundation of that soup.
And of course, Sean, we're talking about the picture that we have in front of us now. And one of the reasons you're tracking this over time is it could look very different a few months from now if we should go into a recession.
We've already seen the story shift from household budgets and the impact of inflation on household budgets to now the impact of the fight against inflation and those higher interest rates on household budgets, whether it's mortgage payments, auto payments, credit card payments, student loans, and so on. And I think the next shift that we're going to see, we're likely to see, is the impact of a slowing economy and what many economists still expect could be a recession, either in the fourth quarter of 2023 or the first half of 2024, that election year. And that is going to change the picture for the middle class yet again. One of the numbers I really keep in mind is 1%, and that is a 1% shift in the unemployment rate equals 1.6 million people in the U.S. losing their jobs. We are now at historic lows in terms of unemployment, around 3.5%. If we shift to 4.5%, 5%, maybe even 5.5%, 6%, we're going to see millions of people lose their jobs. What we've seen so far is that a lot of those people have been white-collar, middle-class workers, and we may see a lot more of that to come.
Sean, just so you don't leave us in despair, is there another scenario?
Yeah, look, the other scenario is that the U.S. economy does what it has done so far, it's fair to say, this year, and that it's been remarkably resilient, and that the labor market and the jobs picture for a lot of folks holds up, and that we emerge next year from the pandemic and the economic damage that we've seen and all of the turmoil that we've seen in a much happier place, both for the American middle class and for America as a whole.
Sean, always great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show.
It's always wonderful to be here.
Thanks for listening to us here at The Big Take. It's a daily podcast from Bloomberg and iHeartRadio. For more shows from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. And we'd love to hear from you. Email us questions or comments to bigtake@bloomberg.net. The supervising producer of The Big Take is Vicky Vergolina. Our senior producer is Catherine Fink. Rebecca Chasson is our producer. Our associate producer is Sam Gebauer. Raphael Amsili is our engineer. Our original music was composed by Leo Sidran. I'm Wes Kosova. We'll be back tomorrow with another Big Take.